G'day everybody and welcome back to another episode of Crafted by Tim. Today is somewhat of a somber episode because I'm giving my final thoughts on the Opti-Turn TU1503V before I move it on to a new home in a different workshop. And I replace it with the AL51G! So if you've been around my channel for a while, you probably recognize this lathe from about 4 years ago when I did a review on it. Was it 4 years? 6 years ago! 6 years ago, apparently. In that time, it has copped quite a bit of work and a fair bit of abuse. Probably more abuse than work. I want to give my final thoughts on this at the end of the video. So if you're here just for that, I'm going to leave a timestamp at the top of the description so you can find it really easy and skip ahead. But if you're here to learn more about the AL51G and why I chose that machine, stick around because we're going to get straight into it. So when I purchased this lathe all those years ago, I spent $800 and I got a couple of extras with the lathe. And my main goal was just that. I just wanted to spend the bare minimum amount of money so that I could get started. But as time went on, I realized that the user unfriendliness of this lathe outweighed my desire to make things. And because of that, for the first couple of years, it didn't actually end up doing an awful lot of work. And I would mainly just do odd jobs like resizing fittings and that sort of thing. Then as time went on, and especially more recently with the projects I'm currently working on, I found myself needing to rely on it a lot more. And eventually I realized that I needed more accuracy than what this little lathe could afford. Enter the AL51G. So this time around, I was less focused on budget, more focused on accuracy, reliability, and size. Because I didn't want something that was going to be too big or too small. And because of all of that, I spent twice as much on just this lathe than what I did on the Opti-Turn. Now hold your horses. That isn't to say that I spent $1,750 on just the lathe and getting the roughly equivalent loadout as I did with the Opti-Turn. No, this is a fair bit more. Where the Opti-Turn gave me the bare bones basics to get started, minus a couple of important things like tooling and a drill chuck, it did come with a 3-jaw chuck, reverse jaws for that chuck, some spare gearing for thread cutting, a couple of tools like Allen keys, and a dead center. The AL51G came with a fair bit more. It still came with the 3-jaw chuck with the reverse jaws, but it also came with a 4-jaw chuck, a traveling steady attached to the saddle, fixed steadies wherever you need them, a faceplate, additional gears for threading, again, 2 dead centers, and a toolbox full of tools. Anything that you need to open this up and do maintenance. Even including this tiny little oil dripper bottle, because nothing says machinist like a small unlabeled bottle of oil. Now one of the first features of this lathe that I wanted to talk about is this large backing plate. It does a great job at protecting the motor. Small benchtop lathes have this issue where they are designed with the motor almost directly behind the chuck. And that is okay, but that's where a lot of swarf, a lot of oil, a lot of stuff ends up migrating directly into that area and it can cause damage to the motor. On this lathe, that motor is actually really well protected. On the Opti-Turn, on the other hand, it's not only exposed, but it's almost funneling swarf and that sort of stuff towards the motor. And although it is almost completely protected, I wouldn't mind still sticking a little bit of rubber just over that last portion there, making sure that it's completely covered, and to help stop things from falling in underneath the chuck where it's difficult to get them back. Now all of that being said, I do have to mention that the fabrication of the backing plate leaves a little bit to be desired. And the other downside is the fact that I now have no access to the pegboard that's directly behind, which is my bad. Now another really cool feature is this adjustable tailstock. You can adjust it left and right to help line it up perfectly, and this is something that I've actually had issues with in the past. And whilst we're talking tailstock, even though the machine came with 2 dead centers, I went out and purchased myself an upgrade. Because this has an MT2 taper, or a 2 Morse taper, I was able to get one of these. A live center. I've wanted one of these for so long, and you can get them for an MT1, but they're more difficult to source. But these are readily available, which is awesome. I'll never have to grease another dead center ever again. The construction of the tailstock is actually also very nice. It is much better at holding heavier tooling in comparison to the wet noodle that is the tailstock on the Opti-Turn, which would sag if I put the drill chuck in, and I would often have to support it whilst drilling, which is not Good. One of the big advantages of this lathe is the availability of tooling. Unlike the availability for the Opti-Turn, which is very limited, it would often take quite a bit of searching to find something, usually online, or modification to fit certain tooling, which is something that I ended up actually doing, but it was not very elegant, and I'll touch more on that later. This tool post actually supports 12mm tools, which are pretty readily available. You can pick them up from most machine shops, so replacement parts are all over the place, plus upgrades. For instance, swapping this out for a quick change tool post. One of the last features I wanted to touch on was a little bit lower down, the ease of access. It is a quality of life thing, but it is so nice to have such good clearance underneath the lathe so that I can clean up really easily. That's one of the things that really annoyed me about working with the Opti-Turn, is that everything is difficult to clean. Anyway, that's all well and good, but what about all the bad? Well, one of the first things that I'm going to miss is the VFD drive on the Opti-Turn, allowing me to quickly change between speeds without having to change the belt on this. But the added bonus is that my lathe shouldn't stall out if it's running large stock at slow speeds with a reasonably decent cut. Some of the quality stuff is a little bit hit and miss. Some of the tools that it comes with are a bit interesting, but hey, at least it came with something, right? But the one thing that bothers me so much is the chip tray. I do not know how many comments I got on the first video on this lathe with people saying, "Tim, your chip tray is upside down. That's not how a chip tray goes. Bro doesn't even know how a chip tray goes on." Yeah, bro doesn't. When I made this first video, I just threw the chip tray on like this because I was like, well, it kind of makes sense that you have a little lip that runs around the outside so you can put your dead center there when you're not using it, and it raises the chip tray high enough that you can get some bolts underneath it so that the lathe itself isn't sitting directly on the bolts and it's actually stable. It is a dumb design, and this lathe is no different. And this wouldn't be too much of an issue. I could just flip the tray over like I did on the first one, except this lathe weighs 130 kilos, which A, is difficult to pick up, and B, would probably crush the chip tray. And yeah, I ended up doing something pretty dodgy to get the bolts in from the underside, but shut up, I don't want to talk about it. I know why they do it so they can upsell you a stupid stand that costs you an extra $300 or $400, but I've got a perfectly good bench right here, and it's a bench lathe. Let me use my bench. Realistically, with a little bit more planning and forethought, I could have probably just made my own tray with captive bolts or nuts and enough room underneath that you would be able to thread those bolts all the way through without running into the rubber, but I didn't think that far ahead, so this is where we're at. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's make some chips. now that I've had an opportunity to run this lathe, oh man, I want to rant and rave about how good it feels, how smooth it is to move. Everything feels really good about operating this lathe. However, there are a couple things. First of all, that rubber situation about the motor, definitely doing that. A lot of stuff has already fallen down there. And the other place that I'm going to do is the front of the tool saddle. That definitely needs to be covered. One thing that I've noticed as I was actually going to set it up is that the tooling nor the lathe actually came with any shims. This, you actually need some shims to set it up. It's about 1.5 mil off, so I've put some 1.5 mil mild steel stock underneath that just to get me by. I'll eventually swap it out for some actual shims. Now we're on to book week. Now, I was really dreading a super dense and thick book that was going to come with this, and it was going to take an entire week to read through. This is worse. This is on par with the other dumbest book that I've ever read, which is A Pickle for the Knowing Ones by Timothy Dexter. Oh my god, how are they so similar? From the spelling mistakes to the grammar issues, and hey, that's all fine, provided that it actually had some decent information in it. Unfortunately, however, it has all the generic information in it, what sort of safety standards you should be having. Things like, don't wear gloves, don't have jewelry, make sure you wear your safety glasses, make sure you don't have a chuck key in there. That's basics, that's good. You should have that in the manual. I don't need it in a manual if it means that you're not going to put any actual information about this machine in the manual. It doesn't actually have anything about like setting your tool height, that sort of stuff. I know how to do that from previous experiences, but if you're coming into this completely fresh, you're probably not going to know. Thankfully, YouTube's there for your help. But when it comes to specific stuff, there are a couple places where this really falls down. First of all, the belt speed. It doesn't tell you how to change the belt. It has a belt tensioning lever, but that only actually works when the belt is on gear position B and not gear position A and C. Without being too technical about it, there are 3 gears. A is your motor, C is your spindle, B is like an idler gear. It has a much lower RPM. You can switch your belt from going from A to C to B to C, and you'll get a lower speed rate. This belt tensioning lever only works when you're running from B to C. When you're running A to C, it doesn't do anything. Great, fantastic. Not really an awful lot of information about that. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the feed rate and thread cutting. So I wanted to know whether or not I can leave this in a neutral position like that, or do I need to leave it in some sort of position whilst I'm working but not using it? Whilst this is in position, this lead screw is constantly turning. So if I can leave this in a neutral position, that would be ideal. But is that going to damage the machine? Or is it going to damage the machine if I leave it into a geared position? I don't know. So if anyone knows, please tell me. Alright, now one more thing. On page 15 is the test runs. Test run number 1. Green knob down. This is literally what it says. Green knob down and set the directional switch to position R, as in reverse. The chuck should be turning in a counterclockwise direction. Okay, reverse, that's normally spinning in a clockwise direction. But hey, maybe this lathe is different, maybe it's special. Reverse is counterclockwise. Okay, cool. Now we've stopped the machine, we're going to move on to test run number 2. Set the switch to position forward. The chuck should be turning in a counterclockwise direction. So you're telling me that according to the manual, the chuck, regardless of whether or not I'm set to forward or reverse, should be spinning in a counterclockwise direction. That is not right. I was having a wonderful time turning on this lathe. There was things eating away at me in this book. Can I leave this in a neutral position? That was the main one. Can I leave that in a neutral position, or is it going to damage stuff? I imagine it's probably not going to damage stuff, but I don't know. This is meant to be like an entry-level machine, sort of. This is not an entry-level book. This tells you the very basics, skips a lot, and then is like, oh, by the way, this machine can do this specific thing. Oh, sweet, how does it do that? You'll work it out, don't worry. Overall, I'm very happy with this lathe. The operation and everything like that is great. There are some things about it, like this, that really take me a step back and I go, should I be going in store and slapping this on the table and be like, hey, that was funny, give me the real manual please. Alright, the part that a lot of people continuously ask me about. My final thoughts on the Opti-Turn TU1503V. When I purchased this lathe, my goal was to spend as little money as possible just to get myself started with machining. And I'm not a machinist, I'm just a hobbyist maker. So there's functions on this lathe that I'd never even touched. I never once tried to thread something using the lathe. But as I gained experience, I slowly started to notice more and more of the limitations that this machine came with. One of the positives that ended up becoming a negative is the weight of this machine. It's super lightweight, but that means that it's super prone to chatter. So much so that sometimes it would bounce the chuck guard and it would stop the machine halfway through a cut. It happened a lot on heavier cuts, but when you're talking about a machine this small, a heavy cut is literally anything over like maybe 3/4 of a millimeter. Progress when working with this machine was always very slow. As I mentioned earlier, the motor's placement doesn't do very much to protect it. Mind you, I never had a short, but the motor did get quite warm when it was in regular use. The live feed stopped working after about a year, which really sucked because that was just out of warranty, typical. But since I never really used it, I didn't feel any need to try and repair it. The bigger issue that I had was the tool holder. Being only able to hold 8mm tools severely limited your options for what sort of tools you could actually run in this lathe. That was most often the disposable carbide cutters that I had in that very first video. And whilst these tools work fine for light work, they do flog themselves out and wear out quite quickly. Eventually, what I ended up doing was removing the tool holder from the lathe, and I filed down the tool holder to be able to accommodate larger tools. It was out of warranty, so I figured what's the harm in trying? But once I upgraded from those disposable carbide cutters and moved on to carbide insert cutters, suddenly this became an enjoyable experience. I actually had a lot of fun with this. I could cut harder materials like Damascus, and I started to really appreciate all of the things that this lathe was actually capable of. But eventually, between the chatter, the tailstock droop underneath the weight of the chuck, I eventually outgrew the accuracy of this little machine. And that is why I decided to upgrade. The big question is, would I buy it again? And the answer is no, I wouldn't. But not for probably the reason that you're thinking. I wouldn't buy this again because I think there is only so much that this machine could actually teach me. However, I do not regret buying it in the first place. For its size and its price, this was a good beginner's lathe. I made plenty of mistakes that could have been very dangerous or expensive had they been on a larger machine, but with every mistake, I learned something. I learned better work holding techniques, more appropriate speeds to be working at. So if I could talk to my 19-year-old self, shouldn't you buy that lathe, I'd probably turn around and say, go for it. At $800, and despite all my complaints, I reckon this is one of the best beginner lathes available on the market. A lot of the quality issues that I had are not exclusive to this lathe. A lot of the cheaper Amazon lathes also suffer the same issues. So in the end, buying locally and ensuring that I could transport it safely and supporting local business, if you will, that was more important to me than buying something cheap off Amazon that I didn't know whether or not it was going to arrive in one piece. And at the end of the day, this lathe did exactly what I needed it to. It taught me heaps, and it gave me a gateway into this awesome variety of making stuff within my hobbyist shed. I fought with it a lot, but that's sometimes just the way that progress is made. That's how you learn, is you make mistakes, you struggle, but you figure things out eventually. And when you do learn, you can upgrade. There's no point in going to one of those really high level machines if you don't already have the skill set, if you don't have the basics and the fundamentals that something like this could teach you. And when you make mistakes, they are a lot less devastating on this than they are on that. So realistically, there was no reason for me to go for a bigger machine without the lessons that the Opti-Turn has taught me. Anyway, I want to hear what you guys think. If you had to start machining today, what would be your lathe of choice? Do you have an Opti-Turn, or are you more on the AL? I'm keen to hear what people think about them, whether or not you've run into issues with your machine, whether or not you're looking to purchase. Leave a comment below, because I'm keen to know what people are actually feeling about these machines, as well as if you have any further questions, I will try and answer every single comment that I get. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Now that I have my new lathe, I'm going to get straight back into the project that's just over here. So more videos on the way soon, and I will catch you all then. In the meantime, do remember to stay safe happy crafting, and as always, cheers.